There's also been an ongoing nonviolent struggle in the occupied Western Sahara against the Moroccan occupation there. So, you know, there's a the Middle East. In many ways, this is not totally new, though obviously the scope is on a qualitatively higher level. And it's important to note that these uprisings we've been seeing, not in Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and elsewhere, are not spontaneous. In fact, many of these others are as well. I mean, we often, you know, don't know about this kind of stuff until the cameras get there and you see hundreds of thousands of people on the street. But these come out of, you know, years of protracted struggle. And you know, as many of you know, there's been a dramatic growth in civil society in Egypt in recent years. You know, increasing waves of labor strikes, the ever larger pro-democracy struggles, the general strike in April 2008, which gave the name of the April 6th movement. The increasing government repression, worsening economic conditions. The parliamentary elections this past fall in Egypt, which were even more transparently rigged than usual, led many of us to suspect that such an uprising was only a matter of time. In fact, I had an article published in early December, right after the parliamentary elections, where I did predict that Egypt would be the next country to have a Serbian-style nonviolent pro-democracy insurrection. I mean, technically I was wrong because the Tunisians beat them to it, but a lot of us who were familiar with what was happening in these countries are not totally surprised. This is something that had been going, was planned. They wanted, this was, some people didn't expect, including myself, didn't expect it quite as soon, but this was, in many ways, it was a long time coming. And the underlying thing is that people want to be free. Despite our stereotypes in the West, Arabs and Muslims don't like to be jailed or tortured or murdered for their political beliefs any more than Western Christians do. That the form a democracy takes will certainly vary depending on the country's unique cultural and historical circumstances, but everybody wants accountable governance. Everybody does want political freedom and social justice. And what also gives me hope is that unlike armed struggles, with their martial values and their tradition of an armed elite vanguard, nonviolent movements, because they rely on a broad coalition representing many segments of society, because they include not just young able-bodied males, but men and women, young and old, again, big cross-country section of society. They require the kind of compromise and cooperation and coalition building that's really critical for democracy. And again, empirically, with a few notable exceptions, like Iran in '79, nonviolent overthrows of dictatorships tend to lead to democracies, whereas armed revolutions that oust dictatorships more often than not result in another dictatorship. So what we're seeing basically, just in conclusion, just want to emphasize that democracy will come to the Middle East, I believe, but not through foreign intervention, not through sanctimonious statements from Washington, not through voluntary reforms by autocrats, or armed struggle by a self-selected vanguard. It's going to come through the power of massive non-cooperation and with illegitimate society and the strategic application of nonviolent action by Middle Eastern peoples themselves. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wish you were here to debate Tariq Ramadan, because I totally agree with you and disagree with him. I was wondering if you could comment about Libya.
Yeah.
And
well, Libya is interesting because they had their most dramatic successes in the first week when they were overwhelmingly nonviolent. That's when they took over half the country. That's when you had the mass defections, among the military officers and ambassadors and Gaddafi's closest aides and mistresses and everybody. That's when they seemed to be on the verge of winning. And it was only after taking up arms, essentially meeting Gaddafi on his strongest point, that they started suffering defeats, and which then led to the NATO intervention, which has had at best a mixed success. And of course, that plays into sort of Gaddafi's hands. Libyans, with the exception of the Saudis, are probably about the most xenophobic peoples in the Middle East, and it's no accident that Gaddafi stands beside the ruins of buildings bombed by the United States in the 1980s, and so he plays on that legacy, and of course the brutal brutal Italian colonialism in the early 20th century. And anybody know the first U.S. administration that intervened in Libya? Thomas Jefferson. Stephen Decatur, the Barbary pirates, and the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. That unfortunately, it's really played in hands and consolidated his shrinking support. I don't think it's simply because, as some people say, he is more brutal and ruthless than the others. Like I say, Mubarak, Ben Ali, any of these guys would have quite willingly massacred people if they thought they could get away with it. We now know that people like Marcos in the Philippines, Honecker in East Germany, they ordered massacres, but troops refused to obey their orders. I think what's made it more problematic in Libya is, for one thing, you don't have a regular standing army. That you have foreign mercenaries, you have militias that are through tribal or other kind of loyalties are harder to break. And indeed, it's a rentier state. To my knowledge, no classic rentier state has ever been overthrown by a nonviolent struggle, which doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but it just means it's much more of a challenge. Of course, civil society, and not coincidentally, is weaker in Libya than it is in the other countries. But I do think that I still think I think they would have been smarter, frankly, to stuck to a nonviolent path. And again, not making moral judgment. I'm not a pacifist. And I would never want to judge how another people, would fight for their liberation. But there's a lot more nonviolent action about masses of people standing in one place. That you, just like a guerrilla army, sometimes you need a tactical retreat, diversify, decentralize your tactics, consolidate your support, and come back and using more diverse tactics, et cetera. I think probably the smartest thing to do right now would be accept Gaddafi's ceasefire, create a good model of governance in liberated areas, and through a combination of international sanctions of the government-held areas, remobilize the popular resistance, the nonviolent resistance inside the Gaddafi-controlled areas. One of my concerns right now is, while the initial uprising, I think, was as authentic a pro-democracy struggle as in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, and Syria and elsewhere, is that that some of the folks have gone to the head of the arms struggle. These are people who were top military people or cabinet officers in Gaddafi's regime until a few weeks ago. One of them is a kind of sketchy character that's had CIA connections for at least 30 years. And some of the veteran fighters happen to be these Salafi types who had an arms struggle in the mountains against Gaddafi back in the 90s. In other words, people who aren't necessarily dedicated to a new democratic order. That makes me a little nervous. I mean, even though I'd love to see Gaddafi fall as much as anybody. So, Libya's a tough one. I mean, either way you look at it. Yeah.
I guess the question that occurred to me is, what should the United States policy be with regard to a strategic ally, which is an authoritarian government? Yeah. I mean, in Egypt, when she was Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice made a speech about encouraging democracy in Egypt, which apparently Mubarak was furious about, and was furious at both her and the Bush administration.